What I'm thinking about is, as these people are finding out their revolution didn't come, with Trump, they're still sad, they're still miserable. What are they doing? I mean, some of them feel very, like disappointed by Trump and his triple parentheses cabinet, and their lives are still shitty. And obviously, it's horrible to hear about these, the sort of online culture producing or encouraging like psychotic singular acts of violence. But like these people are trying to like make think tanks, at least their media classes. I think there is a risk of them becoming politically powerful and professionalizing, especially when the liberal mainstream media has done such a poor job at being able to articulate exactly what the actual threat is.
Absolutely. And I wanted to ask you about that, Angela, like specifically a figure like Richard Spencer. Like he does have a think tank now. And I remember we were talking just the other day about the failure of the media to deal with a figure like this, like the failure to pin him down or ask him any kind of question that would reveal his worldview, because it seems like they've settled on the fact that he's dapper, that he doesn't look like a typical ghoul.
Yeah, because Nazis never wore suits or uniforms.
He has a finely tailored Hugo Boss suit, unlike any Nazi that's ever existed. But further than that, like they sort of in interviews and stuff, like you brought up the one with Vice. He was just on a show with Camus Bell, or I saw him talking with Charles Barkley. I did not even click play. I could not subject myself to that.
I know what I'm doing right after we finish recording.
White ethno state. Oh man,
terrible.
I can't
terrible.
believe it.
But okay, so like the media thing, like when they talk to a figure like that, they'll be like, "You don't actually believe all these things, right?" And then he just goes, "Yes, I absolutely do." And they just sort of go, "What?"
Yeah.
And they never get any further than that. And by doing that, they are granting him this status of being edgy and the outsider and things like that. But like the point you brought up is that we alluded to this at the beginning of the show, is that nobody actually asked him about the many like on the record statements he has about what his central goal is, which is creating not just a white ethno state in Montana and then America, but this pan Northern Hemisphere white like empire, which stretches from...
And you look at the recent French elections, there was a legitimate fear there that like they're moving in that direction. And again, who had a huge chunk of the 18 to I think 24 vote more than ever? It's more because everyone else associates, the National Front with Vichy. But like there was a huge youth turnout for like, yes, we like Le Pen. That's the France we want. So I think they could professionalize, or at least let's keep a fucking eye on that.
Yeah, keep an eye on it. But like to the point about the goal about this ethno state, which they are serious about, and like this is what it's all driving towards. The question is for like anyone who, someone like Richard Spencer, who's like the sort of intellectual leader of this, or any of the people online who pretend to like him or are part of this sort of weird nihilistic, like, play acting or whatever, is how committed are you to this goal and how would you achieve it? Spencer himself, I believe, has said something along the lines of voluntary deportation, like the Mitt Romney line about, they would deport themselves. Self-deport. Yeah. But they can't possibly believe that.
Yeah, I know. They I'm sure they don't. I mean, the thing is, you're right. They're never asked these questions. They're never asked challenging questions. And, I don't think I've seen a single good interview with Richard Spencer. I haven't seen a single tough interview, It's all been of the sort that you describe. You can't possibly believe that? Yes, I do. And he always comes back then with something even worse than what they asked him, if he really believes that. And if you're a socialist, for example, you're constantly, even if you like are arguing for the most minor, like, reforms or like, you know, something like that, you're always told like, you know, that's totally impractical, that could never happen, you know, even if like that exact thing that you're talking about has happened in some other country and has been applied brilliantly, you're always told that's impractical, can't happen. Oh, and if you go any further, it's going to end in a big bloodbath.
Venezuela.
Yeah. And these people are just like let off the hook. I've never seen them once asked a specific question. How do you plan to implement that? What do you plan to do? So I would say, you know, if somebody's interviewing them, here's some of the things you could ask them. First of all, you want to restore patriarchy, right? So you have to get the women out of the workforce. How do you plan to reduce the workforce by half and remain a geopolitical dominant power in the world? That's question number one. And just like, you know, and like Spencer's whole style of evading these things is that whenever he's asked a really difficult question, he always gets extremely dismissive and kind of like, you know, shitty, and there's definitely a tone that comes into his voice when people ask him a specific question. For example, I remember seeing him being asked a sort of ask me anything type of thing like with fans, and one of them asked him if he had read Camille Paglia, you know, and actually there are things in Camille Paglia that I could see them, you know, I could see why some alt-right people like her.
A love of Madonna, number one.
But, you know, it is all about gendered patterns of civilizational decline, you know.
Yeah.
So that it would be, if I was alt-right, I would be thinking that was very interesting. But he was completely dismissive of it. So he obviously hasn't read her, you know. But anyway, the point being, first of all, know that when the scoffing and that particular tone happens, it doesn't mean that you've actually asked anything wrong. You've probably asked exactly the right question. Ask them the practical questions. How are you going to do this? So that was the gender one for a start. The other one would be, we know from just looking at different conflicts around the world, from Palestine to Northern Ireland, people don't just leave. And in fact, even on these tiny little plots of land.
These are tiny area, like countries.
Yeah, you want to do that on a massive scale,
like the size of Rhode Island, basically.
Yeah. And you know, and people will endure all kinds of horrible things, and they'll live in a state of constant war just to not leave because it means so much to people. And the idea that everyone would just get up and leave, I mean, where on earth would they go? You know, and it's one thing for, you know, if he's talking about, like, say, illegal immigration, and then maybe immigrants who were not born in America, but then when it's also going to have to mean people who are here since the slave trade, like, and it's also going to mean like basically everyone who isn't white who lives in America. Like, that would be, there is simply no way of doing that without genocide. And I would love to hear their explanation for how they would do it without genocide.
Is that you think that's their awareness of that is why many of them are so obsessed with the idea of white genocide, of this kind of passive displacement of like white people, this idea that that white birth rates naturally declining in wealthier countries is in and of itself a form of genocide? Yeah,
I know. And they think also that white women making the completely voluntary choice to have children with a non-white man is white genocide. You know, it's just so ridiculous. You know, I mean,
excuse me, but cultural Marxism much? Frankfurt School, they're being brainwashed. It's not of their own volition. Porn, Jewish produced porn has brainwashed them into thinking that big dicks are more pleasurable to have sex with, which they literally believe that, by the way. That's not.
Yeah, we saw that. Yeah.
Here's the thing that we've brought up before, though, concerning the media, and maybe Spencer in particular. I think T brought it up when we had him on the show, and Amber's brought it up, is that Spencer in particular knows, and I think he disseminates these skills to the chuds and the 15-year-olds, is he knows how to play liberals and liberals in the media. And he's clearly studied very closely the vernacular and the way to talk and the way to turn something around on you. Could you maybe talk a bit about like the fluency with which they're able to vex all these, you know, people in the mainstream media who fail to ask these types of questions or who stumble suddenly? Yeah, well, he does say very, very knowingly say things like, we want a safe space for white people. Yeah. And so he knows exactly what he's doing there. But in terms of how they kind of play liberal media, I mean, the thing is, you know, the people who have interviewed him, you know, are not like
are not people who've spent the time that he has, thinking about political philosophy and about all these kind of, I guess, genetic and, other kinds of questions. And so, even if you don't, whatever, he obviously what he's proposing is horrible, and that sort of goes without saying. But, you have to admit, he is good at what he's doing. He's smart. He plays
him like a fiddle.
Yeah,
he
exactly.
comes out on top in many of these interviews, as you said.
Yeah, he does. But the thing is, I don't want to insult the people who've interviewed him, but they're not people who are used to having conversations about big political ideas. You know what I mean? And none of the people who have interviewed him have been people who are used to having those conversations. So he's able to, kind of make light work of them. But so another problem though is that there are questions that are, difficult to talk about, that are somewhat taboo, and nobody in the mainstream is talking about them as a result. But for example, when they say, if you change the demographics of the Western world to the extent that they are being changed now, and if that pattern continues, and they've worked it all out, here's the date when whites will become a minority, and so on.
When Skynet becomes self-aware.
But, the thing is, that will profoundly change the Western world. And the traditional cultures of Europe, are going to die out probably. They'll probably be there in some sort of shops that tourists go to or whatever, but they will effectively die out. And what is the kind of liberal answer to that? They really don't have one. Is their answer, yeah, and that'll be fine, and who cares? Everyone's just sort of wandering around. It's all meaningless. That's essentially what they're saying. And even on the immigration issue, their answer to it is so bad. It's essentially this kind of technocratic thing of well, growth figures go up if you bring in lots of immigrants who, because they've come in at a certain age, you didn't have to educate them. They've been educated in their own country. So you bring them in, get really cheap labor, and then you get some growth. And because of the birth rates, you won't have that inverted pyramid of a lot of older people and so on. So there are all these really difficult questions, and the taboos around them are there for a reason. And I'm actually pretty, I believe in taboos. I think they should be there. So I don't think I'm not saying this in a way that we should be able to talk about immigration and race however we want or something like that. No, I don't think that. But I do think that the taboos mean that a lot of people are very out of practice at even talking about these ideas. So where do we hear a case for free movement that is something other than that crappy kind of...
it'll help the economy.
Right. Technocratic stuff.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, that's half of what also liberals use for any kind of social democratic welfare reform.
Yeah.
They're if we give women maternity leave, actually it will help the economy. It's you need to get back to talking about what is humane and what is inhumane.
Yeah. Angela, in this book, it's a concise history, like you said. It's about 8 years from the election of Obama to the election of Trump, right? And this weird online culture. But in it, you also give a very concise history, if you read it, of the intellectual currents of the postmodern left. That's very interesting because you again, we've talked about this, how adeptly they have been picked up and utilized by the alt-right. And one of them is this idea about transgression and transgressing moral and societal boundaries, which was of course a staple of the New Left. And you date it back to the Marquis de Sade, but there's a long tradition here. And it's always a double-edged sword, right? When this idea that to just completely abandon, a moral argument for anything, it's not always going to redound to your favor, because the best argument for income redistribution is a moral one, right? So the alt-right are gleefully amoral. They love, they hate, you talk about in the early days of these forums, moral fag or care fag was the worst insult that you could possibly give to someone.
Yeah. So basically, when I was looking at the way that people were responding to these guys early on, one of the things that was really irritating was that people, journalists and so on, like the Vice woman. I mean, I don't want to single her out too much, but that was quite bad. And the Vice woman who interviewed Richard Spencer. But, there is this tendency to kind of almost show a certain reverence for these kind of countercultural type of styles that they've picked up. So I remember that woman who interviewed Richard Spencer saying something about, trolling the trolls, or like, I can troll better than you. And it was so stupid. Like, but, that is the thing. Like the real problem with them is a moral problem. Like, they don't feel bad about it. It is like talking to someone who doesn't know that it's wrong to like kick someone in the head or something, and you have to actually rationally explain it. Like they simply they don't feel that anything they're doing is wrong, and this is why they're Nietzschean as well. Like,
it's liberation, it's emancipation for them.
And it is liberation from having to feel guilt. And they would say that, like, it's liberation from having to feel white guilt, I suppose, but any guilt whatsoever. And like I do think like that there is a moral core to socialism or any kind of egalitarian politics. Like these are moral questions. No matter how much of a materialist you think you are, you're motivated by a moral question, basically. And I think maybe that's a better way. Rather than trying to like be more edgy than them or any of this stuff, just say no. I'm sorry, that's adolescent nonsense. Like and the amoral stuff is just you have to come back to them with kind of moral questions.